All right, so with the introduction out of the way, the foundations and the vocabulary, let's get into the click-by-click and command-by-command mechanisms that we'll go through to implement our Active Directory infrastructure. Starting first with this first task titled Add or Remove a Domain Controller from a Domain. We're back here on our machine DC. This is the same machine that you were working with Jason back on that last course with DNS and DHCP on network services. And this machine is currently still in a work group. I have it here with the address 192.168.0.100. And I also have, as you can see here, DNS services installed onto the machine. So there may be a little misalignment here between what you see here and what you saw back when you were working with Jason, but at the very least, we've got the very basics in place so that we can get an Active Directory infrastructure up and running. I do want to show you here under DNS Manager that I have a forward lookup zone created for company.pri, and I also have a reverse lookup zone created for the 192.168.0 net. And there's not much here, right? I have my DC and I have my DC2 computer currently in this reverse zone. And then over here on the other side, I have DC and DC2 both here in company.pri. So I include this here in this review of DNS because one of the ways in which you can go through a pretty simple test to see if this machine is ready to be promoted into an Active Directory domain controller is to first verify whether or not you can correctly resolve all the possible ways that this machine may need to be resolved. Now, I'm going to show you how we can accomplish that, or at least one way we can, and that's to bring up the command prompt here. And what I want to show you is that here within the command prompt, there is the command ns lookup that you probably dealt with back when Jason was talking about DNS, that you can use for checking DNS records or records for a machine in a DNS database. What I'm going to show you is probably not on the exam, but it's my own little cheat to make sure that I've got all the DNS bits in place so that I can resolve appropriately and guarantee myself, or almost guarantee myself, a successful promotion of an Active Directory domain controller. There are three different tests that I use, the first of which is to just the short name for the machine. Here, if I type in nslookup dc, you'll see that dc.company.pri indeed resolves down here against the same server, which is this server dc.company.pri. If I have exactly this response, meaning a successful response without any problems, then that's a success for the first of the three tests. The second test for me is to then try to do an nslookup across the entire fully qualified domain name of the DC I'm about to promote. That would be, in this case, dc.company.pri. And once again, you can see here that we have a completely successful test coming back from our DNS server. In some cases, you may end up where the first of these tests resolves correctly, but the second of these tests does not. And this happens most often when back up here, when we were taking a look at Server Manager, when you went about configuring the computer name for this machine, one of the things that you can ignore doing in just about every circumstance, except for the case where you're creating a new Active Directory domain controller, is in changing not only the full computer name, but down here under the More tab, making sure that you populate the primary DNS suffix for this computer. Again, most of the time we just ignore this step and don't worry about it when we're making a change to a computer name. But in this case, if I don't end up populating this primary DNS suffix for this computer, I'll end up with this second test here ending up with some kind of error message as opposed to what I'm seeing. The third test then is to do the reverse lookup, which would be 192.168.0.100. And again, I get the same response here. So as I said, this has nothing to do with the exam, but I like to use this as just a little test to make sure that I've done everything correctly to prepare myself for adding a new machine as a possible domain controller. We now have to go through that process of doing that addition. So essentially promoting this machine from a member server into a domain controller. And here in Windows Server 2012 and R2, the way in which we accomplish that is now 2 steps as opposed to just 1. Let me come back over here to the dashboard and choose to add roles and features. And it's here where I want to show you the first of the 2 steps. Back in the old days, there was a command called DC promo, which you may still need to know here for this exam, but it has been deprecated in this version of the operating system. In the old days, DC promo would complete the installation of the necessary bits and then go through the promotion activity to turn a member server into a domain controller. But these days, the activity requires you here in Server 2012 and R2 to first install the ADDS bits, so the role and associated role services that create Active Directory domain services. If I go through this process and add in all the roles and the role services and necessary features, this will give me everything I need to then, in the second step, complete the promotion. If I choose restart here and yes, and then install, that will go through the process of actually installing in the necessary components. Now, if I wanted to do this from the command line, one of the ways I could do this from the command line is through PowerShell. And if I come up here to run as administrator, I can show you just a quick PowerShell command that you've already seen back a couple of courses ago when we were talking about adding and removing roles and role services. The install Windows feature command is what I can use against AD domain services. That's the role I'm interested in. This command will install the Active Directory bits onto this machine, just like what I've done here in the graphical user interface. There is an additional parameter you may want to use called include management bits or management tools. That additional parameter will install not only Active Directory domain services, but all of the other management tools that you would use to manage it. Now, we won't run this here because obviously we're already installing the Active Directory bits onto this machine through the graphical user interface. But we'll keep this open here because I want to show you how you would do the second step of the process, both through the graphical user interface as well as through the command line. As you can see back here in the Add Roles and Features wizard, we've completed the installation of the bits, and now we need to go through the promotion of this server to an Active Directory domain controller. And it's here where we have a very large number of decisions that we have to make. Hopefully you've made these decisions before you get to this point. So one of which is whether or not we're going to be installing a brand new forest. So is this the first domain controller in the first domain in a forest that we're creating brand new from scratch? Or are we adding a new domain to an existing forest? If we're adding a new domain to an existing forest, we are creating another triangle underneath the triangle that we have already created before. Anytime I'm adding a new domain to an existing forest, this will be the first DC in that new domain. But in order to establish the connection, the trust between the two, I would need to choose one of the available domain types, that being either a child domain or a tree domain. The biggest difference here is that a tree domain gives you the ability to create a non-contiguous namespace for the domain I'm creating. For example, in a child domain, if I were creating a child domain off of company.pri, the domain name I would be creating would be something.company.pri. Again, this is different from a tree domain where I could be really anything that I wanted to. In either case, I'd need to populate the information about what domain name I'm creating down here at the bottom, and then obviously provide some credentials down here to perform the action. I do also have a third deployment option up here, which is to add a new domain controller to an existing domain, which is, of the three, the one you'll find yourself doing quite a bit more than the other two. In this case, all I need to do is identify which domain I'm interested in, and then provide credentials for it down here. We are, however, creating a brand new forest. A brand new forest, a brand new domain, and a brand new domain controller. And so, because of that, we need to create a new root domain called company.pri. When I do that, I'm going to have a variety of different other options and configurations that I need to set for this domain and forest that I'm creating. The first of which is determining what the forest and domain functional level will need to be for the domain. Now you'll notice down here that there are a couple of different options for forest and domain. In fact, I think there's a couple for forest here and just a single one here for domain. These functional levels define a set of capabilities that existed at the time that that version of the operating system was released. So back in the year 2008, when Windows Server 2008 was released, there were certain types of activities at the forest level that forest could accomplish. Microsoft then later wrote additional functionality and added it into the operating system with the release of Server 2008 R2, and again in 2012 and again in 2012 R2. In most cases, when you're creating a brand new domain and a brand new forest, you'll want to create that forest and domain with the highest functional level available. But occasionally, if you have applications that you know will not function with that forest or domain functional level, well, you may need to set it down to one level below. More often than not, in the vast majority of cases, the highest functional level is indeed the one that you're looking for. Now, when you're also creating a new domain controller, you have some additional capabilities that you can apply on the domain controller itself. The first of which is whether or not that machine should be a DNS server or not, and whether or not that machine should be a global catalog. Because this is the first domain controller in the domain, in the forest, we already have this selection here, selected forest for a global catalog. We have to have it as a GC. And because we've already installed DNS onto this machine, the checkbox here is grayed out as well. It is possible to have the ADDS configuration wizard install DNS server onto this machine as part of the wizard. However, personally, I've never seen it function very well. I've always had better luck with getting the DNS server bits installed prior to beginning the ADDS configuration wizard. So it's my recommendation to always start with installing DNS first before you get this far. Down here at the bottom, we have what's called the Directory Services Restore Mode password, which is a special password that you will enter once and then never need to enter again, except in the situation where you need to perform an authoritative restore of the Active Directory database. Now, this authoritative restore is a bit of a painful activity. And because of that, there are a lot of tools these days, third-party tools that you can use, and even some first-party tools with the Active Directory Recycle Bin that ease the process of recovering data out of the Active Directory database. So recognize that when you set this DSRM password, you need to put it in a safe place, because until you change it yourself, this password will never be changed again. All too often, we find people that have created DSRM passwords with the creation of their domain and forest, and that information gets lost until years, many years down the road, when an authoritative restore is required. And the last thing that you want is to try to find a DSRM password when you don't have a functioning domain or functioning forest. So pay careful attention to this, and probably put it in a safe place somewhere, because you may need it at some point in the future. Down here next is where we can specify any DNS delegation options. These will allow us to create the appropriate DNS delegations so that we have the folder structure in DNS to support the SRV records that we'll require. When we do that, we can punch in the administrator username here and the password to create the correct credentials for creating that DNS delegation. Down here under next is where it's going to verify the NetBIOS name that's going to be assigned to the domain. The NetBIOS domain name will be, in most cases, the first set of characters before the first dot in whatever fully qualified domain name that you create. In our case, it was company.pri, and so company, all the characters up to that first dot, is what makes that NetBIOS domain name. There are some cases where it will not be those first characters. The NetBIOS domain name needs to be, I believe, 15 characters or less. So you might want to take care to ensure that any of the names in your fully qualified domain names for those that you're creating stay under that 15 character limit. If I choose next again, I can define what the paths will be for the different components of Active Directory that are to be installed. The database folder, the log files folder, as well as the sysvol folder here can be determined. Now, in a production world, you may want to move these off onto a different disk drive, just so that you have them separated out from the operating system. I'll leave them here as C because I only have a single disk drive on this machine, but again, in a production world, it can be a good idea to move those off onto separate spindles, if anything, to make the process of recovering this machine a little bit easier. I'll choose next, and we can go through the review of the options here, and I want to direct your attention down here at the bottom right to this little item called View Script. This view script item down here is what gives you the abilities to reproduce everything that we've talked about in this wizard, except using the PowerShell tool to do this from the command line. Notice the script that gets created is a .tmp file, which if you end up needing to save this, you have to put it in the correct format so that the script can be executed by PowerShell. But recognize that what we're doing here is running the import module ADDS deployment command here, and then we're running the install ADDS forest command with this long list of parameters that effectively answer all the questions that we've run through here in the wizard. I'm showing you this at this point because it is exactly this piece of code here that would allow you to reproduce this process using the command line if I were to do so here in Windows PowerShell. So this would give you the abilities to streamline the process, to automate the process, to just know how this works using Windows PowerShell. I would know how this is and know that essentially running through this, perhaps even just running through it and pretending to answer all the questions in the way that you would give you a really nice piece of code here that you could just punch into the command line to get this machine brought online. This is particularly helpful, not so much when you're creating your first domain controller, but when you're going about creating all those additional domain controllers, those DCs that will come online after the first DC and the domain are created. It is the creation of those additional domain controllers and the PowerShell commands that are used in creating them that you can then copy and paste and just adjust in some of the information in here to rapidly deploy those additional domain controllers as you see fit. For our purposes here, let's go through and hit the next button and then allow our prerequisites check to complete so that we can go about the installation of Active Directory domain services onto this machine DC. Looks like all of our prerequisite checks completed successfully, so I'll click the Install button to begin the installation of Active Directory. And then finally, thanks to the magic of video editing, I can accelerate us to the completion of this installation process. As you can see here, after the reboot, we have a machine DC that is currently in the company.pri domain. And if I come up here under Tools, we have the usual Active Directory tools that have been installed. So here under Active Directory users and computers, we can see that we indeed now have this domain company.pri.